Welcome to a special edition of the Golfer's Journal podcast, presented by Titleist, the #1 ball in golf. Now here's part one of Red, White, Black, and Blue, written and narrated by Broken Tea Society member Chandler Withington.
The scene, the Belfry, Wishaw, England, September 13th, 1985, Friday morning foursomes. Americans Hal Sutton and Craig Stadler are paired against Englishmen Howard Clark and Scotsman Sam Torrance. Stadler has split the fairway on the second hole, leaving Sutton with a 5-iron approach. Sutton pushes the approach ever so slightly, and his ball buries just underneath the lip of the bunker. Rather than the usual sympathetic groan from the gallery, a roar raises from the left of the green. Sutton looks over at Stadler confused. What are they doing? Stadler replies, they're clapping for you. Sutton, did they see where I hit it? Stadler, yeah. Sutton, why would they do that? Stadler, get used to it. It's going to happen again and again and again and again. Hi, I'm Chandler Withington. In 2016, I was the head golf professional at Hazeltine National and a consultant to the winning American side. That year, I got to see behind the curtain of how Ryder Cups are won and lost. Strategy, course setups, roster building, chemistry, and of course, some friendly and not so friendly gamesmanship. In this 2-part podcast series with the Golfer's Journal, I'll attempt to set the table for this year's Ryder Cup at Bethpage by focusing on 2 key storylines. In part 1, we'll look at the simmering animosity between the Americans and the Europeans and trace the evolution of a once friendly exhibition into what has become hat-waving and parking lot shouting matches. And in part 2, we unpack how 2 completely different team philosophies have formed to create 2 contrasting team styles. So how did we get here? To answer that, we have to go back to 1985. Up until Friday morning of the 1985 Ryder Cup, things had been somewhat friendly. Good play was applauded, and galleries generally only reacted to the shots played by the side they were supporting. But on this morning, the ground was shifting underneath the feet of the Americans.
The spectators helped. The golf was good, but the cheers rang out, and it's one of the few times in British golf that partisanship, God forbid that it should ever get to a point where it becomes nonsensical, but they actually cheered for British putts. And they sort of half applauded for missed American putts, which the Americans misconstrued, and they weren't used to losing.
From Curtis Strange, 1985 was the first time I'd ever played in front of fans that weren't rooting for you real hard. You know what I'm saying? They're rooting like hell for their own team and didn't give a rat's ass about you. So that was an eye-opener. I was fine with it, but it was troubling to some of the players on the team. What had suddenly changed? Why would English golf fans, generally considered the most knowledgeable, respectful, and polite of all golf fans, begin actively rooting for the demise of the Americans? To understand the shift is to understand how rivalries begin in any sport. Have you ever grown tired of hearing about the success of a team? Perhaps you were exhausted from the Belichick and Brady dynasty in New England? Or you no longer needed to hear about the New York Yankees and their 27 World Series titles? Or maybe you were a Detroit Pistons fan in the early 1990s and simply couldn't stand one more article on the greatness of Michael Jordan. If you were a European golf fan between the 1940s and the early 80s, you were forced to watch Americans dominate the sport that was birthed on the shores of the UK. From 1947 to 1977, Great Britain and Ireland had managed 1 win and 1 tie in the Ryder Cup. They were powerless to stop the tide of American superstars. Hogan, Snead, Palmer, Nicklaus, Trevino, Littler, Weiskopf, Floyd, Watson, Casper, Miller, Stockton, Nelson, Watkins, Irwin. Whether it was major championships or cup competitions, Americans had gathered all the trophies and the headlines. Englishman Tony Jacklin, who'd won the 1969 Open Championship and 1970 US Open, was merely a brief respite. Things got so bad at the Ryder Cup that Tom Weiskopf actually skipped the 1977 event to go on a hunting trip to Alaska. The Americans still crushed GB&I 12.5 to 7.5 at Royal Lytham, and that victory sparked a change that many feel saved the competition. Jack Nicklaus, who'd grown tired of beating GB&I so badly every 2 years, had a discussion with the European powers that be, which eventually resulted in the team changing from Great Britain and Ireland to continental Europe. Their timing could not have been better. Welshman Ian Woosnam, Scotsman Sam Torrance and Sandy Lyle, and Englishman Nick Faldo were part of an emergent group of UK stars, but the change to continental Europe meant they could be joined by an icy young stud from Germany named Bernhard Langer and a fleet of emerging Spaniards led by a fiery kid whose last name was Ballesteros, but who would become known by just his first name, the same as Elvis or Pele or Madonna. It was Seve in particular who had had enough of the American glory and who ultimately led the rebellion on a course. It was Jacqueline who captained the newly dubbed Team Europe 4 times from 1983 to 89, who played field general. Together, these two men would shake up the golf landscape and lay the foundation of what still stands as golf's greatest rivalry. Do you want to know the quickest way to light a match and ignite a rivalry in any sport? Openly disrespect your opponent. By the 1980s, this was something the Americans had turned into a bit of an art form. Despite the change to Team Europe, things appeared to be getting even worse for them. The U.S. won the 1979 Cup 17-11 at the Greenbrier. The beatings continued at Walton Heath in 1981, where the Americans won 18.5 to 9.5. But at PGA National in 1983, the young Europeans began flexing their muscles and only lost 14.5 to 13.5. The dam broke in 1985. With the players and crowd turning on the Americans at the Belfry, Europe won easily, 16.5 to 11.5, and hoisted the cup for the first time since 1957. The 1987 Ryder Cup was held at Jack's Place, Muirfield Village in Ohio. Whatever decorum the Golden Bear may have been hoping for quickly evaporated. Seve had already established himself as a fierce competitor, and this tournament established his legendary reputation as a Ryder Cup killer. On the second day of competition, he was joined by countrymen Jose Maria Olazabal against Curtis Strange and Tom Kite in 4-ball. This story is best told by Strange himself in the oral history Us Against Them by Robin McMillan. From Strange: on the first hole of the match in 1987, I wanted to fucking kill him. I'm playing with Kite. We'd had our rules meeting the day before. Some of that's on sportsmanship and courtesy and playing within the rules. To make a long story short, we discussed having a, quote, through line, which means the line of your putt past the hole. You don't want people putting on it if you missed the previous long putt. On the first hole, Seve had a chip from just off the green. I had a long putt down the hill and putted it past the hole. Olazabal putted, then wanted to putt out, but I said, well, wait a minute, you can't do that. You're right on my through line. Seve came charging up to me. That bother you, he said? That bother you? I said, yes, that does bother me. And so Seve stomped over to his chip and chipped it right in the back of the hole, then walked off the green, pumping his fist at me. I almost had to applaud him. More power to him. God damn, I was so mad I wanted to kill him. The Europeans went on to win again.
They have a 5-point lead, and this is serious for the Americans.
When the Ryder Cup returned to the Belfry in 1989, American captain Ray Floyd, attempting to take a page from Ben Hogan's book, introduced his team at the opening ceremony as, quote, the best 12 golfers in the world. The introduction didn't land well with the Europeans. Jacqueline would later respond, I suppose this means Seve is the 13th best player on earth, does it? Keep in mind, at that point, Seve had won 5 majors, including 2 green jackets, and fluctuated between being ranked as the number 1 or 2 ranked player in the world. Sam Torrance said, that was a bit of a faux pas on Floyd's part. We just loved it. Carry on, say what you like. It worked for us, not against us. Work for them it did. The Americans would suffer their 3rd straight defeat and returned home to Kiawah Island in 1991 with a rivalry in full bloom and where the gamesmanship on either side was only intensified. When the Americans arrived in South Carolina, they did so wearing camouflage. It was no small gesture. This Ryder Cup was being played in the midst of the ongoing Gulf War in Iraq. The subtlety was gone. What was once considered a friendly match was on par with a global conflict. Further, the American visors had, quote, "The cup belongs in the USA" embroidered on them. Bernhard Langer was not amused. The Americans had the idea of wearing camouflage caps that had the Marines logo on it, he said. We felt that wasn't appropriate. This was not a war. We had been allies in the Gulf War. Now they are portraying like they are fighting us in a war. More gas was poured on the fire when during a pre-tournament gala, the PGA of America ran a video titled, quote, "War at the Shore." The video was touted as the history of the Ryder Cup, yet it didn't show a single highlight of the Europeans, despite the fact Europe held the Ryder Cup for the prior 6 years. They showed us the history of the Ryder Cup, all the best players, and all they showed were Americans, no Europeans, Langer said. We had just won 3 Ryder Cups. That didn't go down well with us. It was like, what are you guys trying to do here? Make us mad? That wasn't a good thing. Nick Faldo agreed. It didn't just stop with the video. There was loads going on. A local radio program had this thing called Wake the Enemy that week, where they would call the European players' rooms in the middle of the night. But he was a bit of an idiot because he didn't realize we were all getting up at 5 or 6 in the morning anyway to go practice. So we saw it as a wake-up call, which was great. Once play began on Friday morning, it didn't take much time for tension to come to the surface. A rivalry within a rivalry had begun 2 years prior when Seve drew American rookie Paul Azinger in the leadoff match on Sunday singles. When Seve attempted to take his ball out of play on the second hole of their match because of a scratch on the ball, Azinger refuted, saying his ball had the same scratches. Seve, staring down Azinger, said, "If that's the way you want to play, that's the way we will play." Azinger gulped, but didn't back down and found a way to beat Seve 1-up. Now, 2 years later, Zinger and Seve were right back at it in the first match of Friday morning foursomes. Seve being joined by his Spanish Armada partner Jose Maria Olazabal and an Azinger partner with Chip Beck. Right from the start, it was one conflict after another. A controversial drop on the second hole by the Europeans, a question on if it were the Europeans had lost their ball in the fourth, a dispute over where the Europeans should drop the ball in the ninth hole. The Europeans had overheard the Americans talking about which compression ball they play for approaches into greens on the prior holes. However, the rules did not allow for teams to change out balls during the play of the hole. While the Americans had in fact breached the rule, the Europeans had not raised the issue until it was too late. Getting a proper ruling wasn't really the intent of Seve in the moment. It was to get under the American skin, and it worked. The Americans were 3-up at the time, but would go on to lose the match 2-1. Clearly shaken, Azinger and Beck could barely bring themselves to shake their opponent's hand at the conclusion of the match. In the nearly 100 years of the Ryder Cup, it has only come down to the final putt on the final hole of the final match on the course to decide its fate. For the Ryder Cup, a competition that was on life support just 15 years prior, a finish like that couldn't have come at a better time. TV coverage and viewership was at an all-time high. In Sunday singles, Hale Irwin and Bernhard Langer reached the 17th tee with Irwin clinging to his 1-up lead. "I was 1-up," Irwin said, "but missed the 17th green with my tee shot. As I'm walking to the green, I see Seve talking to a teammate in Spanish. Trying to keep things light, I say, 'Hey Seve, what did you say?' He looked at me and he says, 'I said, too bad you didn't hit it in the water.' That didn't bother me at all. He was competitive, so was I. But Irwin lost the hole." Playing 18 all square, if Irwin could have the hole, it would give the Americans what they needed to win back the cup. Lose the hole, and the cup would go back to the Europeans for a 4th straight time. After Langer found the fairway with his drive, Irwin hooked his ball well into the gallery. What could have easily become a lost ball, or at least a perilous situation, Somehow the ball hit a spectator in the back and found its way well back into play and in the short grass on the fringe of the fairway. People still argue the spectator's back, which coincidentally belonged to a woman who later worked for the PGA of America, saved the day for the Americans. Irwin had his bogey putt conceded, ultimately leaving Longer with a 6-footer to win the hole in a 4th straight Ryder Cup for the Europeans. When his putt slid by on the low side, the American celebration was on, culminating with the Americans throwing their captain Dave Stockton into the Atlantic Ocean. It would have helped if the PGA hadn't called it, quote, the war on the shore, Stockton later said. I appreciated Tom Watson following me as captain in 1993, saying he was going to restore some civility back into it. But I'll tell you what, I stirred up a hornet's nest, but I don't care, because it's good to have. We tend to become complacent. But that's not what I remember most from my time at Kiawah. When we were going to the last dinner, the PGA had put on 2 buses for the teams, the American bus and the European bus. Woozy came up to me and said, Stock, we can get everyone on the one bus. We're only 2 people shy. And with that, he picks up Corey Pavin and carries him on the bus so that he counted as 1 person. A wonderful moment, and we had a great time together on that bus. That's what I like to look back on and remember. Tom Watson would indeed restore some civility as captain in 1993, and it wasn't the last time he would attempt to do so. An American win at the Belfry in '93 restored order to what the Americans perceived as rightly theirs. But when Europe flipped momentum back in its favor, with both wins on American soil in 1995 at Oak Hill and on their own turf at Valderrama in 1997, both with Seve at the helm, it was clear that this was a rivalry that would last. That was the vibe when the competition arrived at the Country Club in Brookline, Massachusetts in 1999. But there was some baggage from Spain 2 years prior. At Valderrama, European Colin Montgomery decided to speak his mind. Some of the comments were mild. He put himself on equal footing with Tiger Woods, something he had already done earlier in the year at Augusta before Tiger left him in a vapor trail. He also said Phil Mickelson was, quote, unreliable, and that Jeff Maggart, quote, wasn't intimidating. But then he got downright personal. At one point, he said that if the cup was on the line, he hoped Scott Hoke would have to make a short putt for the Americans, a direct reference to Hoke missing a short putt to lose the '89 Masters. But most inflammatory of all came when he spoke on Brad Faxon, saying that he was, quote, going through a divorce, and mentally, I don't think he'll be with it. That led to several non-Ryder Cuppers in the U.S. going after Monty. Fred Funk called him, quote, the jerk of the world, and Bob Estes said that he was, quote, a crybaby. Monty was forced to apologize in person and in written letters to the Americans. And yet, because the Ryder Cup is always about results, Monty still went 3-1-1 that year to help Europe keep the cup. It all made the Brookline stage even brighter. It was at the Country Club in 1913 that many consider America woke up to the possibility of golf when 21-year-old amateur Francis Ouimet defeated the 2 English stars who had really shown Americans how to play the game in the first place, Harry Vardon and Ted Ray. Despite having lost 2 prior Ryder Cups, the Americans sure hadn't lost their arrogance. And while the old European guard of Seve and Faldo and Longer had given way to younger stars like Padraig Harrington and Lee Westwood and Sergio Garcia, the Americans felt with Mickelson, Tiger Woods, and Justin Leonard on their side, they were primed for victory. Payne Stewart said, quote, on paper, they should be caddying for us. Jeff Maggart chimed in, quote, let's face it, we've got the best 12 players in the world. Jarmo Sandelin of Finland was among the 5 rookies on the European side. Sandelin wasn't exactly a household name to many American golf fans, but he was most certainly on the radar of one of the American players. 3 years prior, Sandelin almost came to blows with Phil Mickelson during the Dunhill Cup at St. Andrews. Sandelin was celebrating his frequent birdies by pretending that his putter was a rifle. He claims he was only shooting at the hole in a sort of obnoxious celebration, while Mickelson felt the imaginary bullets were aimed at him. I wasn't going to let it go without saying something, Mickelson said. Walking off the 13th green, Phil said, quote, our noses touched and we had words. Sandelin confirmed the incident. "I told him to fuck off," he said. "I haven't spoken to him since and have no desire to do so." At Brookline, European captain Mark James decided to hide 4 of his rookies until Sunday singles. Sergio Garcia was the 5th rookie, but had already broken out on the American scene at Medina during the PGA Championship the month prior. Paired with the Swede Jesper Parnevik, Garcia had already won 3.5 points for the European side. It was one of the several wise moves by James as his team raced out to a commanding 10-6 lead. Even the most casual golf fan knows what happened that Saturday night in the media center. American captain Ben Crenshaw heralded a historic Sunday with his now legendary quip,
"I'm a big believer in fate. I have a good feeling about this. That's all I'm going to tell you."
When the Sunday singles draw came out, James decided to put his 3 rookies all in a row in the 3 through 5 positions. And wouldn't you know it, Phil Mickelson drew his old friend Jarmo Sandelin. Things didn't get off to a great start for Sandelin. Upon reaching the second green, Sandelin was in the process of trying to mark his ball when he couldn't find his go-to coin. Checking his pockets over and over, the crowd had caught on. One fan could be heard screaming, "Hey Jarmo, you need a ball marker?" In unison, the gallery began throwing coins all over the green. A visibly shaken Sandelin would lose 5-3 to Mickelson, part of a red wall of American wins as Team USA went on to win the first 6 matches. The game was on. As if on cue, Payne Stewart had clawed back to square his match with Colin Montgomery, and Justin Leonard battled all the way back from 4 down to square his match with Jose Maria Olazabal as their match reached the 17th green. The 17th green at Brookline is among the most historic in American golf. Across the road on Clyde Street stands the home of Francis Ouimet, who had also birdied the 17th hole during his U.S. Open playoff with Vardon and Ray, propelling him to victory. With the hole location cut to the back right of the small green, both Leonard and Olazabal hit their approach shots to the front of the double-tiered putting surface. Leonard was away, roughly 40 feet, and first to putt. Just about the entire American team, including caddies and wives, surrounded the green. This was the match that would decide the cup. What happened next is perhaps the most played Ryder Cup highlight of them all. Leonard's putt, running fast as it climbed the hill, hit the back of the cup and disappeared. A euphoric Leonard pumped both arms straight into the air as the American team ran onto the green towards him. It appears to have been Tom Lehman leaping and running towards Leonard first, but make no mistake, the entire team sprinted onto the green to celebrate. And after what felt like an eternity, but was no longer than a minute or so, Leonard emphatically shooed everyone from the green, realizing that his opponent still had a putt to have the hole. Did any of the Americans walk through Olazabal's line? No. Was it likely Olazabal would also hole his putt of roughly 30 feet? No. Did any of that matter to the Europeans? No. Were they absolutely livid about what just happened? You bet. Olazabal would miss his putt, which clinched the win for the Americans. But irreparable damage had been done. The incident was viewed by many in both the US and Europe as appalling sportsmanship. Veteran broadcaster Alistair Cook described the last day of the tournament as, quote, "a day that will live in infamy," in a BBC essay titled, quote, "The Arrival of the Golf Hooligan." Vice Captain Sam Torrance said that many of those who run into the green had done so over Olazabal's putting line, and further singled out Lehman's behavior on the final day as, quote, "disgusting for someone who calls himself a man of God." American newspapers were also critical of their own side. The Washington Post stated that, quote, "it seems an American team can't get through an international competition without acting like jackasses at some point." And the Los Angeles Times described the American team as having, quote, "violated every principle of proper golf decorum and decent manners." Later, some of the American players would even apologize for the behavior of their team, but those apologies would mostly fall on deaf ears. The battle lines of this competition have been forever drawn. As the stakes and intensity of the Ryder Cup accelerated over the years, animosity hasn't just been contained to the two sides. The hell-bent desire to win has spilled over to internal dynamics. In 2008, the rift between European captain Nick Faldo and Sergio Garcia was so strong, Faldo referring to Garcia as, quote, useless, that when Garcia set the all-time points record for a European Ryder Cup player, he replied, "This means a lot to me. I've passed some of my heroes today, and Nick Faldo." In 2014, American captain Tom Watson and Phil Mickelson were famously at opposite ends as Watson had decided to bench the longest tenured player on the team for the entirety of Saturday. In the press conference following the American loss, Mickelson took multiple, indirect but clearly obvious shots at his Hall of Fame captain. As the years go on, more and more Ryder Cup animosity is laid bare between the galleries and the players. At Glen Eagles in 2014, American rookie Patrick Reed missed a short and crucial putt on the 16th hole on Saturday afternoon. As Reed stood in silence on the first tee on Sunday morning for his singles match against Henrik Stenson, a European fan loudly heckled, "Have you worked on your putting, Patrick?" Reed turned his head to the crowd and smiled. He then proceeded to go out and beat Stenson one up. As Reed went along, with every winning putt he made, he held his index finger to his mouth, the universal signal for "be quiet," as he stared down the European fans. In 2016 at Hazeltine National, Rory McIlroy didn't appreciate the verbal jabs he had been constantly receiving on day one. Many of his celebrations over the following days were directed right back at the crowds, culminating with one epic moment when he dropped a 50-foot putt on the 8th hole of Sunday's singles and proceeded to hold his hand to his ear and shout to the crowd, "I can't hear you." In that particular arena, European fans have had the last word. In the Rome 2023 matches, a tweet from British reporter Jamie Weir went viral during Saturday afternoon foursomes. Weir reported that there was dissension within the American locker room and that some players were unhappy about not being paid to play. It was inferred that Patrick Cantlay was refusing to wear a hat to show his displeasure. By the time Cantlay, who was paired with Wyndham Clark against Rory McIlroy and Matt Fitzpatrick, reached the back nine, the European fans understood their assignment. When he teed off on the 16th hole, European fans waved their hats and cheered, quote, "Hats off to your bank account." As it continued through the 17th and 18th holes, the tension was mounting. The Americans were getting absolutely throttled on the scoreboard and needed every point to have even the smallest chance of a Sunday comeback. When his putt found the hole, it set off a raucous celebration on the American side. Cantlay, putting his hand to his ear, a la McIlroy from 2016, and the supporting American team just off the green began waving their hats at the crowd. Some might say it was all good fun until it wasn't. Cantlay's caddy, Joe LaCava, got caught up in the moment and was still waving his hat at the crowd long after Cantlay had stopped. He was also standing near the spot where McIlroy was to putt to potentially square the match. A visibly agitated McIlroy had words with LaCava. LaCava, a legendary caddy who has looped for both Freddie Couples and Tiger, didn't back down and kept going right back and forth with the rest of the assembled Team Europe. McIlroy missed his putt, leaving the Americans with a small bit of momentum heading into Sunday. Hours later, a clip surfaced showing McIlroy engaged in a shouting match in the parking lot with another famous caddy, Jim Bones Mackay. Teammate Shane Lowry was among the throng holding back McIlroy as he was clearly not happy about the moment on 18 and was letting Bones have it. The following day, McIlroy would win his singles match and Europe would cruise to victory. While American captain Zach Johnson had insisted that LaCava had reached out to the European side and apologized to McIlroy, when asked about it after the conclusion of his match, McIlroy said he had not heard from LaCava and seemed to still be upset about what had happened, calling the incident, quote, "fuel for the fire." McIlroy called the victory one of the greatest in his career. The days of skipping the Ryder Cup to go on a hunting trip are officially over. Winning the Ryder Cup is now on par, and for some, even more important than major championships. And because of those incredibly high stakes, everything about the event is now examined and scrutinized. After the American defeat in Rome, the PGA of America shocked the golf world by naming Keegan Bradley the 2025 USA captain. But how big of a shock was it? In the next episode, we dig into team philosophy.
Thanks for listening, everyone. The Golfers Journal has been proudly reader-supported since 2017, so if you enjoyed this podcast, we hope you'll consider becoming a Broken Tee Society member by subscribing at golfersjournal.com. And whichever team you're pulling for, we hope you have a great Ryder Cup.